So tonight is indeed my pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Werking. He was the library director and professor of history emeritus at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis. But he grew up in Evansville, Indiana. He's a graduate of the universities of Evansville, Wisconsin, and Chicago. He is the author of The Master Architects, Building the United States Foreign Service, 1890 to 1913. Among his other publications are biographical essays included in Indiana's 200, The People Who Shaped the Hoosier State. So without further ado, Richard.
Thanks very much, Julie. Good evening to all of you, and thank you for coming. First, a note of thanks to the Filson staff for helping me prepare this talk, and two staff members in particular, to Heather Potter for the park images that were rolling by up here for quite a few minutes, along with some other pictures that you'll see as part of the lecture. And also to Scott Scarborough back there for helping me get all these pictures up and running into a couple of slideshows. Louisville's public parks are among the city's most important assets, yet relatively few residents may be acquainted with the early history of our park system, including how our three largest parks got their names. Some have speculated that it was Frederick Law Olmsted himself, the prominent landscape architect who contributed so much to the park system's design and subsequent reputation, who named Cherokee, Iroquois, and Shawnee Parks. But the historical evidence tells a different story. And as usual, the history surrounding the subject is richer and more complex than it initially seems. And it's a history that interests me. I'm a recent immigrant to Louisville, having moved here from Annapolis less than 4 years ago. Like many of you, I'm a big fan of the city's parks, and given my location in St. Matthews, especially of Cherokee Park, which I first experienced when visiting Louisville in the late 1960s. Though I've done quite a bit of research on how Louisville's parks got the names they have today, I'm certainly no expert on the history of the park system, much less on Louisville history in general. For those of you interested in learning more about the park system in its early years, I've prepared a short bibliography of titles that I found especially useful in my explorations, along with a few tips for searching the public library's online database of the Courier-Journal covering the years since 1830. All you need is a library card. Copies are available on your way out after the lecture. Now to that park's history. During the second half of the 19th century, American cities began to emulate their European counterparts in establishing public parks. As the Industrial Revolution steamed ahead and urbanization accelerated with factories and their labor forces living in close proximity, civic leaders became interested in establishing parklands within and on the edges of their rapidly growing cities. Such areas were seen as features that would attract residents, improve property values, and provide all classes of the population with cleaner air and with opportunities for aesthetic enjoyment, relaxation, and recreation. Central Park in New York City, of course, was the first urban landscape park in the United States, beginning in 1857. It would be 1880 before Louisville got into the act. That's when the city's former graveyard, in use from 1786 until 1832, became its first public park, located on Jefferson Street between 11th and 12th and named Baxter Square in honor of the retiring mayor who had long been a parks advocate. It's still there. In his annual message of 1881, Mayor John Baxter called for much more than had been done so far, noting, "A public park would contribute more to the health, wealth, and moral purity of this community than anything I can imagine. There is not a city in the United States of even half our size which does not possess a public park. We have no place either for a drive for our own citizens or where we can show strangers and visitors. Making clear how inadequate he considered the 2-acre plot that would bear his name, he added, "The park should contain from 500 to 1,000 acres of land." By way of comparison, in the mid-1890s, Cherokee, Iroquois, and Shawnee Parks together totaled just over 1,000 acres. I have it on good authority that today that number has grown to 1,400 acres. Baxter's successor as mayor, Charles Jacob, also called for action and for funds, in the process stimulating many suggestions for possible sites. As Samuel Thomas says in his very good book, Louisville's modern park movement had begun, but it would be a few more years before tangible progress was made. In 1887, at meetings of the Salmagundi Club, with Thomas Speed and Andrew Cowan playing leading roles, the issue of providing public parks was discussed and enthusiastically supported. The cooperation of the city's commercial club was obtained, while a report drawn up by Cowan and others was produced and published in the Courier-Journal in June of 1887. It made a strong case for public parks, observing that in addition to offering employment and maintaining the public schools, we must also provide for the recreation and health of the people. Public parks for the recreation, health, and benefit of the public, and free to all forever, are recognized as imperative necessities wherever large bodies of people have come together for permanent residence. In addition, the report emphasized public parks would be an economic asset. The Chicago parks had shown themselves to be a profitable investment, while Central Park in New York City was getting, quote, heavy revenue derived from adjacent property, unquote. In short, public parks would benefit the city by making it a more attractive place to come and work and to live healthier lives, undergirded by a growing economy that would benefit from the development of a park system, enabling Louisville to at least keep pace with its urban competition. The plan found its way into state legislation thanks to John Mason Brown and Andrew Cowan, and in May 1890, the Kentucky State Legislature passed the act authorizing Louisville to issue bonds for a park system and create a board of park commissioners, if the city's voters approved. And so it was during the summer of 1890, while Benjamin Harrison of Indiana was serving his single term in the White House as president, that Louisville established its park system. In 2 elections that summer, 1 month apart, the city's voters selected 6 men to serve as members of the Board of Park Commissioners, and then, a month later, approved a bond issue to finance the whole enterprise. Note the order here. The first task was to identify the men who would be responsible for acquiring and then maintaining the parklands, and who would be accountable to the public for the hundreds of thousands of dollars expended in the process. Only after knowing who these commissioners would be, it was felt, could the citizenry determine whether or not it wanted the park system. Playing a central role in helping to establish that system, distinguished especially by his work in naming the major parks, was the longtime president of the Filson Club, Reuben Thomas Durrett. Today, the Filson's website continues to honor him as the primary founder of the organization, established by 10 Louisvillians with a common love of history. It was Durrett who in 1884 convened the founding meeting in his home, located on the northeast corner of Chestnut and Brook Streets, now, of course, the site of a major hospital complex. Subsequent meetings were likewise held at Durrett's home, and he served as the group's first president from its founding until his death in 1913, a tenure of 29 years. Here's a bust of him done by the sculptor that Julie mentioned, Enid Yandel, whose career Durrett actively supported. In fact, in 1891, he contacted officials who were planning the Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair to be held in 1893, recommending her for a position there as a sculptor. And that's where Ms. Yandel went to work soon after graduating from the Art Academy of Cincinnati. And let me just echo Julie's point that if you haven't yet seen the terrific Yandel exhibit that Heather Potter and her colleagues have put together over in the Bingham Gallery, you should. And they still might have a few Enid Yandel buttons left. Born in 1824, Reuben Durrett earned degrees at Brown University in 1849 and 1853. In 1850, he obtained a law degree at the University of Louisville and began practicing law. From time to time, he also wrote and published poetry. In 1857, he became editor of W.N. Haldeman's Louisville Courier and was co-publisher with Haldeman until 1859, when he tired of newspaper work and returned to his law practice. In that same year of 1859, he declined a new governor's offer of political office. Regardless, the governor wanted to reward him for some campaign speeches Durrett had given on his behalf, so he sent him a commission as a colonel, something that happens from time to time in this state, I've been informed. It was a title he employed proudly and by which he was addressed thereafter. Early in the Civil War, Durrett's pro-Southern writings as a contributing editor for the Courier antagonized federal government officials. And in the fall of 1861, U.S. Army General Robert Anderson charged Durrett with treason and aiding the rebellion. Anderson, whose name might be familiar to some of you, was a native Kentuckian and former slave owner who was a major for the United States Army, had commanded the garrison that surrendered Fort Sumter to the Confederates in the spring of 1861. Durrett was arrested and incarcerated for several months in a federal prison, but gained his freedom and returned to Louisville in 1862, resuming his law practice. In the early 1870s, he played a major role in establishing the Public Library of Kentucky, what's now the Louisville Free Public Library, by drawing up the organization's charter and, for a time, serving as its president. At various times, he also served as president of the Children's Free Hospital and the Episcopal Orphans Home. Reuben Durrett's law practice was financially successful, and he retired in 1880 at the age of 56 in order to produce research, writing, and building a most impressive library collection on the history of Kentucky and the Ohio Valley. And here he is, again, at this time in his library. As seen repeatedly in his extensive correspondence, housed here at the Filson, its president was widely considered to be the foremost expert on the history of Kentucky. In 1891, the vice president of Louisville's Board of Park Commissioners reminded a local editor that Durrett was, quote, the man who has done more than any other Kentuckian to frame Kentucky history and to establish respect for Kentucky historic incidents, unquote. A couple of years later, the Paducah News characterized him in charming fashion. He is a living cyclopedia of Kentucky history, and there is not an important event in the annals of the state from the days of Daniel Boone to this year of grace that is not stowed away in the good gray matter which the colonel carries under his hat. Nor was this just a matter of locals taking pride in one of their own. In 1895, the United States Bureau of Education in Washington was planning a series of bibliographies dealing with the history and biography of the southern states, and it needed a knowledgeable compiler for each state. An official there asked Durrett to take on this task for Kentucky, appealing to him through your well-known and long-continued interest in anything that pertains to the history of Kentucky. You are no doubt better acquainted with the subject than any other man alive. And from what I have heard, it would in this case be little more than a catalog of your own library of Kentuckiana. Several decades earlier, long before Louisville's first park elections, Durrett had been a member of the city council while he was still in his 20s. In that capacity, he had tried to persuade his fellow councilmen to support a policy of planting willow trees on Corn Island in the Ohio River to save that small piece of real estate from erosion and ultimate extinction and converting it into a public park, he hoped. But the council didn't share his concerns, and Corn Island eventually disappeared into the river. Many years later, however, with the parks question looming before the voters, it seemed he might have another chance. Given his earlier support for the environment and his overall prominence in the community, it's little wonder that early in the summer of 1890, Reuben Durrett was nominated to stand for election as a park commissioner. There were 12 nominees for 6 positions on the park board. The mayor would serve as an ex officio member, being number 7. And there were 2 tickets of 6 men each, one comprising all Democrats and the other a so-called calico ticket consisting of 3 Democrats, including Durrett, and 3 Republicans. Remember, this would be the first of 2 special elections related to parks, a vote first for the 6 men and the second a month later on the question of approving the parks bill itself, along with its $600,000 price tag. As to why the vote for the commissioners came first, Andrew Cowan would explain it 3 years later, saying that the purpose was to give the people a chance to defeat the parks bill if the parks commissioners were chosen in the interest of any land scheme. 3 days before that first election, Durrett demonstrated his strong interest in becoming a park commissioner when he took the unusual step of sending the Courier-Journal, then as now the city's most prominent newspaper, a handwritten letter to the editor on behalf of his candidacy. It's an interesting document once a reader masters the handwriting. 9 legal-sized pages telling us a good deal about the man while providing details about the election process too, so it's worth an in-depth look. By the way, history teachers sometimes tell their students who are writing papers, don't just tell the reader, show the reader. That same advice can sometimes be useful for lecturers as well, so this evening I'll be doing a fair amount of quoting the words of our story's leading figures. In this instance, Durrett's letter thoughtfully provided the editor not only a headline for his piece, but also the subheads that were normal for lengthy newspaper stories of the day. And the letter began with half a dozen of these. Parks in Louisville, their lost opportunities and present prospects, Colonel R.T. Durrett. Reviews the situation, past and present. An interesting letter, well worth reading. To the editor of the Courier-Journal, the history of public parks in Louisville is more to the shame of our citizens than to their credit. It has taken us 112 years from the foundation of our city to set aside a single square 400 feet long and 200 feet wide, and here, of course, he's talking about Baxter Square, for the use of the public. And to do this, we had to rob the pioneer dead of the graveyard, which their valor had won from the Indian. Other progressive cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston in the east, and Chicago, St. Louis, and Cincinnati in the west can boast of their hundreds and thousands of acres of breathing places and pleasure grounds for their citizens, while we must huddle our 180,000 living souls within half as many square feet, and not even there without disturbing the ghosts of those who laid the foundations of our city and expected no interference with their last resting place until the resurrection morn. As you might be able to surmise, he had a fairly florid, flowery way of writing and speaking. He continues, there are now 12 candidates before the people for the office of Park Commissioner. There have been no party nominations, and every candidate stands on his own footing. Some attempt has been made to divide the 12 candidates into 2 tickets of 6 each, but it remains to be seen whether this decision has been effective. At this point, Durrett's letter shifts from description to advocacy, to making a case, first arguing for political broad-mindedness while still reminding the readers of his own political affiliation, and then putting forward his own qualifications. There is no reason why Democrats and Republicans should not make the race together. Let those who demand that all candidates shall be Democrats ask if the fresh air that is to be breathed in our parks will be less pure because partly introduced by Republicans, if the flowers will be less bright and the grass less green and the trees less shady because partly planted by Republicans. I have no such false notions and find no uncongeniality in running with Republicans for the office of Park Commissioner, which of all offices ought to have in it as little of politics as possible. After summarizing his experience studying not only the public parks of the United States and Europe, but also landscape gardening, he observed, 10 years ago, I retired from the practice of my profession and now have plenty of leisure, which it will be my pride to devote to our parks for the honest purpose of having them take the right course at the beginning. And then his last sentence, if I am not elected, I hope that a better man might be chosen in my place. He didn't have to wait long for a reply. In a note handwritten and delivered on that same day that Durrett wrote and apparently delivered his long letter, the longtime publisher of first the Courier and then the Courier-Journal, his friend and former business partner, W.N. Haldeman, replied, rejecting the piece in these words, my dear Colonel Durrett, I have just read your park article, and while that about parks will do and be willingly published, the latter portion is a vehement defense of Republican candidates, which I could not consistently publish in a good Democratic paper like the CJ. I have therefore to ask you to excuse me using this, and I assure you I do so with extreme reluctance, for I hate to refuse you anything you ask. But you are in bad, very bad company. And I wish you a safe deliverance from your wicked associates. And then on a lighter note, very truly your friend, W.N. Haldeman. As it so happened, Haldeman too was among the dozen candidates in that same election, on the ticket comprising all Democrats, no surprise. Yet an editorial in his newspaper the day after his note to Durrett expressed a very different sentiment about the candidates in the coming election, a generous one, when it declared all 12 men to be gentlemen whose integrity and intelligence ensure for the city a capable, upright management of her pleasure plots. So it's hard to know what to make of the wicked associates' comment. Maybe there was a difference of opinion between Henry Watterson, the editor, and Haldeman, the publisher. Anyway, undeterred and wasting no time, Durrett fired off his essay to another Louisville paper, The Critic, where it was published the next day. Things seemed to happen very quickly in Louisville in 1890. 2 days before the election. It might have secured him a few votes, but probably many fewer than the readership of the Courier-Journal would have provided. The day after the election, the CJ headline declared, a quiet election. 6 good men chosen for park commissioners by a light vote. Only 2 men on the CJ-endorsed ticket of 6 Democrats were elected, while the other ticket provided the remaining 4 winners, 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Departing from the headline's bipartisan tone for a moment, the article did grumble about the low turnout. General apathy was in command of the voting forces, and that is how two Republicans managed to be elected park commissioners of this Democratic city. Well, neither Durrett nor Haldeman was successful in his bid for office, with Durrett securing 8th place among the 12 hopefuls and Haldeman 11th. That part of the outcome probably gave the Filson president a degree of satisfaction despite his own defeat. Haldeman, on the other hand, probably wasn't in a very good mood. Yet Reuben Durrett would have another chance to serve as park commissioner when a member of the board died early the following year, and the board members voted unanimously to name him to fill the vacated position on an interim basis until the next municipal election 5 months hence. Maybe his letter to the editor, published in The Critic, and perhaps strategically circulated among friends and acquaintances, contributed to this outcome. Durrett was joining the Parks Board at an exciting time. Following that second election, which the previous August had approved the $600,000 bond issue by more than a 3-to-1 margin, the commissioners had gotten to work right away investigating possible park sites to purchase. For his part, once appointed, Durrett began obtaining reports from other cities about their park systems. Especially important, though, he would now be in a position to make his crucial contribution during the next several months, that of naming the 3 large parks. They hadn't yet been officially named. That would occur in the summer, a year after the 2 elections establishing the system. As early as April 1891, an editorial in the Courier-Journal expressed the desirability of preserving Indian names in our parks. Because Indians roamed over the lands we are now turning into parks, the editorial read, the use of such nomenclature would foster recollections of a past that should not soon be forgotten. In July, after Durrett had won his seat on the board in the municipal election, his fellow commissioners asked him to prepare a report on Indian names for the parks. Even before he submitted it at the end of July, 2 more CJ articles had appeared reporting a, quote, general sentiment, unquote, among the commissioners for using such names. The newspaper followed up and published Durrett's report the morning after he had presented it to his colleagues. The Filson president championed names drawn from the languages of 3 tribes, Shawnee, Cherokee, and Iroquois. He noted that while only the Shawnees were known to have dwelt in the territory that became Kentucky, 2 other tribes had established occupation claims, claims that had found buyers. These 2 tribes had sold large land areas to Europeans and Euro-Americans, the Iroquois to the English crown in 1768, and the Cherokees to Richard Henderson's Transylvania Company in 1775, just a month before Lexington and Concord started or continued some interesting times in the American colonies. Ironically enough, the Shawnees, the only well-established residents, hadn't gotten in on this act, probably because they wanted to hold on to their territory, which they knew they occupied. Durrett proposed a name for each of the parks, suggesting that the Eastern Park, a 20th century picture of which you see here, be named Chenoe, the Cherokee word for Kentucky, for the Kentucky country. That the Southern Park be called Ononta, the Iroquois word for mountain, very topographically appropriate, as you just saw. And that the Western Park, Shawnee Park, it turned out to be, likely to be situated along the Ohio River, be named Alwamiki. Shawnee for bottomland, again, a very appropriate name matching the topography. The board was expected to make its decision about park names at its next meeting on August 13th. 4 days after Durrett's suggestions went public in the newspaper, an especially entertaining and thoughtful column entitled Parks and Park Names appeared in response in the Courier-Journal. Its purpose was to sound a note of caution, but in a very appealing manner, about adopting these suggestions in the form provided. The anonymous writer, whose columns appeared frequently in the Courier-Journal in those days, signed his work using the name Shadow. The column is a document worth quoting at length, although I'm using only a small fraction of it here. Very efficiently, the column's first sentence shows where its writer was intending to go. Quote, "The question of park names is one of popular acceptance more than of refined taste and accurate significance," unquote. After a few more paragraphs, Shadow observed, "A park like a picnic is a sort of lapse, L-A-P-S-E, from civilization. It's a response to the demand of the primitive qualities that are merely restrained in the cultivated man. Given a park, and considering its motives and purposes, and the causes and effect associated with it, nothing could be more appropriate than to give it a savage Indian name." And he goes on to say, apparently pursuing this idea, Colonel Durrett has suggested for the Louisville parks names from the Shawnee, Iroquois, and Cherokee languages. It appears from his interesting report that these three great historical tribes were occupiers, if not constant habitants of Kentucky, and that with them the pioneer history of the state is most intimately associated. So far, so good. And a nice synopsis, I think, of Durrett's proposal. But Shadow was concerned about two things that he had previewed in his first sentence: the obscurity of all these proposed names, and also about trying to pronounce two of them. As he put it, to have to climb up a name before climbing up a hill would be a double burden on a common wayfaring man afoot. And he proceeded to offer important revisions. "Why shouldn't we just stop at the beginning of Colonel Durrett's suggestion?" he wrote. "Why not have Shawnee Park, Iroquois Park, Cherokee Park? These three names are familiar, distinct, recognizable, of well-established pronunciation, of broad open sound pleasing to the ear, and they are a summary of the Indian and pioneer history of Kentucky." About the southern park, Shadow had this to say: "Colonel Durrett suggests the Iroquois word Ononta, meaning mountain. The tourist visiting Ononta Park might, as he climbed the ascent, ask why it wasn't just called Mountain Park. But Ononta would convey no meaning to ordinarily informed persons. Once on the same summit called Iroquois Park, even the schoolboy, gazing down upon the Ohio River and the broad plain of Louisville, would associate the scene with the fame of the Iroquois and their temporary camps in Kentucky, while the student would recall the Iroquois sale to the English king of the Kentucky lands they did not occupy. And he might ponder on the possible consequences of this early introduction of absentee landlordship. As for the eastern park, Shadow thought that if Chenowe were pronounced clearly, it was a pleasing word. However, he wrote, quote, "If the lisping children of Jefferson County turned it into the familiar name of Chenoweth, no great harm would come. But if an American accent must fall on it, the eastern pleasure grounds of Louisville will eventually appear in foreign guidebooks as Genoa Park." And finally, for the western park along the river, Shadow feared that the pronunciation of Alwamike would soon make the word unrecognizable. But Shawnee Park, he wrote, could not be mistaken, and the bold sachems of the city government, who have their annual fish fry in that neighborhood, would all welcome a brave word like this that can be pronounced in all conditions and under all circumstances. The column finished succinctly with a one-sentence paragraph. Shawnee Park, Iroquois Park, and Cherokee Park are good names to read on the signs and electric cars, as well as pleasing to the ear, and everyone recognizes them as Indian names. At noon on August 13th, the commissioners made their decision, and later that day, the Louisville Post could declare, "The agony is over, so take heart." Indian names have been bestowed upon the city's breathing spots. The outcome matched Durrett's suggested pairing of tribal names with the park locations, though not with the words from the tribe's languages. So why did the board choose Native American names, and why these names? For one thing, as we've seen, there was a groundswell of interest in adopting such names beginning as early as April. That interest no doubt grew and became more focused because of Reuben Durrett's involvement in the issue and the high regard in which he was held. These were three major tribes, perceived to be part of Kentucky's storied past. As that Post story went on to explain, the majority of commissioners thought the historic Indian tribes who formerly owned the land should be honored in some way, and this was the only method of doing it. Moreover, several generations had passed since Kentuckians had been engaged in the often brutal struggle to, as Durrett phrased it the year before, win land from the Indians. Out west in South Dakota, the Wounded Knee Battle, or massacre, it's been called both, had occurred only a few months earlier in December of 1890. Nevertheless, here in our locale, with decades providing distance in time and many hundreds of miles providing distance in space, these Native American peoples of Kentucky were considered worthy of honoring through memorialization. But there was an additional angle in play, a political one, in the outcome, involving the matter of naming the parks after living persons. The board's decision on names wasn't universally popular among some of the politicians, as shown in a Courier Journal article the next day with this headline, quote, "Park commissioners censured by the council for the change of name. City lawmakers do not approve the idea of ignoring Mr. Jacob," unquote. The city council reacted negatively because the Southern Park, Iroquois, already had a name, although an unofficial one. A couple of years earlier, then Mayor Charles Jacob had purchased a piece of land known as Burnt Knob, 6 miles south of the courthouse, and after improving it, sold it to the city for his costs plus interest. Named after him, Jacob Park, as it was generally known, opened in June 1889, though it would not officially be deemed a city park right away. That same editorial introducing the prospect of tribal names in the spring of 1891 also had spoken against naming parks for former mayors, calling it a mistake to have named a park after Mayor Jacob. A few weeks later, early in August, as the board was still considering its options, an anonymous letter to the editor in the Courier Journal, signed "A Taxpayer," weighed in on the same subject and much more sharply than April's editorial. "As a taxpayer," the letter stated, "I protest emphatically against naming either of our parks for one of our citizens, since no one has given a park to the people. Can politicians or newspapers or land speculators or anyone's personal friends, however influential or numerous, convince the park commissioners or the public that any man now living in our city or state has deserved such a monument as one of our parks? There is no foundation for any claim that one of the parks has been named. But if there were, it would not be too late to undo a wrong. The park commissioners should name all the parks and squares." This is just a few days before they did so. If this letter to the editor strikes you as especially articulate and possessing a certain ring of authority, it probably won't surprise you to learn that it was almost certainly written by a fellow named Andrew Cowan, the very active parks advocate and at the time one of the park commissioners, who understandably didn't want it published under his own name. We shouldn't be surprised that Parks Board members were reluctant to go down the road of honoring living individuals, especially honoring living politicians. Having to deal with contesting claims to fame and questions about whom to memorialize would have been a continuing pain, something we in Louisville, of course, these days have managed to avoid. The letter from a taxpayer just scratches the surface of that potential mess. And the City Council's censuring of the Parks Board underscores the existence and strength of differing perspectives. Using the names of prominent tribes was a way out of this thicket. And so, while it was the Board of Park Commissioners who named our three major parks, the individual contributing most to this outcome was Filson Club President Reuben Durrett, as edited by the anonymous and articulate Shadow. A bit more about Durrett in subsequent years. He continued to serve as Parks Commissioner for 2.5 years following his election in July of 1891. And during this time, in the spring of 1893, he traveled to the Kentucky Pavilion at the Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, to preside over the unveiling of the Daniel Boone statue created by 23-year-old Enid Yandel. As probably many of you know, that work of art was a Filson product commissioned by the club for the sum of $700, worth almost $20,000 today, 700 to today. Since 1906, the statue has stood at an entrance to Cherokee Park. At the exposition on June 1st, Durrett spoke about Boone's significance in the following fashion. Little more than 100 years ago, the place where we now stand was a part of the great wilderness of the Mississippi Valley. Little more than 100 years before. It was not possible for such a soil and climate to remain much longer excluded from the settlement and development to which they were destined. What was needed was a class of immigrants with religious and social and political principles as broad as the confines of the Great Valley itself, and so free as the winds that blew over it. Brave and hardy farmers who had the enterprise to select the lands of the wilderness and the courage to hold them against all opposition were the kind of immigrants needed instead of zealous propagandists and lazy fur traders. Fortunately for the Mississippi Valley, such a class of immigrants was now at hand. Various nationalities, after sleeping upon the Atlantic slope for 160 years, had at last produced the wide-awake men and women that the time and the place demanded. All they needed was some leader to arouse them to action and to conduct them to the Promised Land. That leader was ready and soon made himself known to them in the person of Daniel Boone. Durrett acknowledged in his address that likenesses of Boone already existed, portraits showing him seated, but he dismissed these scornfully, saying, "A modern-clad Boone sitting at ease isn't characteristic of this old wanderer of the West." Instead, he went on, what we wanted was a Boone in motion, a Boone who, though always calm, was never still, a living Boone moving along. It was reserved for the genius of a young Kentucky girl to have such a conception of the old pioneer and to embody it in a statue. The faithful young artist has reproduced the identical hunting shirt and rifle and tomahawk and powder horn used by Boone in life. Durrett concluded his speech by committing the statue to the care of the Kentucky Commissioners of the Columbian Exposition to be exhibited as a part of the club's contribution to the World's Fair. I find that last sentence interesting and suggestive, part of the club's contribution. A couple of months earlier, Durrett had received an unusual request from a civil service commissioner that we've all heard of, Theodore Roosevelt. The two men had become acquainted 5 years earlier in 1888 when Roosevelt visited Louisville, spending many hours in Durrett's library while conducting research for what became his well-known multi-volume book, The Winning of the West. But in the spring of 1893, with the exposition looming, Roosevelt had a different purpose in mind. He asked Durrett if he might borrow from the Filson or him, Daniel Boone's rifle to display in a replica pioneer's cabin at the exposition, a project being sponsored by Roosevelt's New York-based Boone and Crockett Club. As Roosevelt's letter explained, we would like very much to have relics of 2 or 3 of our mighty men with the rifle there. I haven't seen what Durrett's response was to this unusual request and wonder if the Boone rifle was another contribution to the fair from the Filson. By the way, here are a couple of photos of Roosevelt's pioneer cabin in Chicago. I pulled off the internet. Here's one. And a second one, chimney aficionados might especially like this one. It's quite ornate. In 1905, when President Roosevelt returned to Louisville, stopping here for a few hours on his way to the Southwest, once again, Reuben Durrett served as a spokesman for his city and state, and this time gave a remarkably short speech thanking the visitor while presiding over some gift giving. Some of your admiring friends, he told the president, in their desire to connect your visit to Kentucky with President Lincoln, have gone to the Kentucky farm on which he was born, and they have cut a block of wood from a tree which grew near his natal cabin and in whose shade the youthful Lincoln played. And they shaped the wood into an inkstand. Knowing that anterior to your presidential career, your fame as a writer was attested to by numerous popular books, and in fact, before he became president, Roosevelt had written and published more than 20 books. He didn't do nearly as many while he was president, but then after he left office, he did almost another 20. They thought that this inkstand would be an appropriate gift, bringing as it did writing material to an eminent writer. According to the Courier-Journal account, Roosevelt was touched and very pleased, greeted Durrett warmly, and took some time looking over the inkstand. Reuben Durrett died in 1913 at the age of 89, 5 months after selling most of his 20,000 books, plus pamphlets, maps, manuscripts, and newspaper files to the University of Chicago. That institution was much better prepared to house this collection and also to maintain it physically and bibliographically than any place in Kentucky. No doubt Durrett was thinking about the welfare of the collection he had amassed over many decades. He was a de facto librarian, not only a zealous collection builder, but also the preeminent reference librarian for Ohio Valley history. His collection, his knowledge, and his cordiality in sharing both of these things contributed immeasurably to the work of prominent historians such as Theodore Roosevelt, Frederick Jackson Turner, and Ida Tarbell, among many others, stimulating among the wider public an interest in the history of our city, state, region, and nation. No doubt he wanted to ensure that his collection would remain an important resource. About Durrett's own historical writing, University of Professor Tom Clark, for many decades considered the Dean of Kentucky historians, concluded that the Filson president was, quote, a productive and proud author whose writings have the character of being part solid historical fact and part romantic wishful thinking, that history should have been that way. As another historian put it in the Kentucky Encyclopedia in the entry about Durrett, some of Durrett's written work reflected his penchant for making a good story better. It's easy for me to imagine that Durrett's habit of composing and publishing poetry as a younger man both reflected and reinforced a style of writing that was flowery and romantic, a style evident in his written communications with the public and his orations. Like the much younger Theodore Roosevelt, he was a romantic, and this trait showed itself in his approach to history, including the names he came up with to bestow upon our parks. Names transformed to what we have today, courtesy of Shadow's helpful and, I suspect, much appreciated editorial assistance. As his obituary in the Courier-Journal put it, Durrett was a man of uncommon talents and of unusual versatility. To conclude, I want to move from the relatively implicit to the explicit and observe that while my focus this evening has been largely about our city's early park system, it's obvious that Reuben Durrett's contributions extended far beyond naming our parks. Those contributions have been multiplied many times over by an institution he founded 135 years ago. That's due, of course, to the work of what we call the Filson Historical Society. Through its collections and through its capable and congenial staff who continue to expand and maintain those rich collections while serving as a bridge between them and the many appreciative researchers and members and lecturers who are the Society's most direct beneficiaries. The Filson members no longer convene for historical lectures and conversation at 202 East Chestnut Street, but instead in this wonderful facility. And so we here this evening, along with many others, are in Reuben Durrett's debt. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention.